Hello, this is Fiona Cuthbertson coming from the pod to record another episode of Off the Cuff. This week we're lucky enough to have the Lord Brady of Altrincham. Before he was elevated to the Lords, Lord Brady was chairman of the 1922 committee for 14 years, a high-profile job at the centre of the Conservative Party, during which he saw 5 prime ministers come and go. He recently wrote his memoir, Kingmaker, before which he was the model of discretion, until now, and with any luck he might have more to tell during this podcast. Welcome, Lord Brady.
Thank you very much.
Firstly, can you tell us a bit about your political journey and what made you go into politics?
Growing up with Margaret Thatcher in number 10, British politics was quite exciting. And I think Conservative politics was certainly the more radical part of political life. So that was the big background. I was 12 when Margaret Thatcher came to office. And then the more specific thing, I was at grammar school in Altrincham, and every time there were local elections, the other parties wanted to close the grammar schools down. I thought that was a very bad idea, and I turned out to campaign in local elections as a result, and I've been doing it ever since I was 16 for that reason.
I was going to ask next, did you ever expect to be able to tell the stories you have when you started your first campaign to save your grammar school?
No, it's one of those funny things. I came from a completely non-political family. Certainly never had anybody who'd been involved in politics. So I didn't really know what was involved. I didn't know what would come my way. Even once I became a member of Parliament, I ended up finding completely unexpected twists and turns in my career, which has made it a very interesting time.
You did say in your book, Kingmaker, that it was the change in party policy on grammar schools that forced you to resign early on in your parliamentary career. Of course, any conflict with the party leadership can risk prospects of promotion. So is this why so few MPs do it now?
It's an inherent tension and difficulty for people involved in politics in the parliamentary system, in that the system works on the basis that you need to have a degree of cohesion within a political party, and that's perfectly reasonable. The public quite likes to see cohesive political parties as well, but then you can find there's a tension with what you actually believe in, especially in that instance for me. It was the specific thing that got me involved in politics in the first instance. It was also a very important issue for my constituents, 4 state grammar schools in the Altrincham South West constituency. So when there was a direct conflict between what the party was saying and what I believed in and what my constituents wanted me to do, I didn't think there was any real choice in it. So no doubt I did the right thing. In a very unexpected way, it worked out well for me, because I think it was the fact that I'd shown that I would stand up to David Cameron, but that I would do so in a sort of polite and constructive way and still campaign and fight to try to make sure a Conservative government was elected. I think my colleagues saw that as the combination they wanted in somebody who was going to be their official representative, if you like, to the leader of the party.
You have gone on record saying that there are those within the top ranks of the Conservative Party that have not understood people. Do you think that's impacted policy decisions that those people might have made at the time?
I think at the time of the coalition government, there was a significant question about this. It was quite telling, actually, that the coalition was run from at the centre by, well, certainly 3 of the 4 people did come from rather similar public school backgrounds. Danny Alexander was the exception. But the other 3, Nick Clegg, George Osborne, David Cameron, I think they very, very easily and naturally fell in together. I guess that is one of the things that caused some of the tensions with other people in other parts of the Conservative Party. And I suppose the most vocal of them was Nadine Dorries in her comment about 2 posh boys who didn't know the price of a pint of milk.
And as chair of the 1922 committee, you were at the centre of the party for a long time, and part of this was the election of new party leaders. During that process, were there any candidates who were particularly bad at answering questions directed to them during the election process, do you think?
I think there is a tendency for politicians to give the answers they want to give in responses to questions. And I suppose most, possibly all, of the leadership candidates were guilty of that to some extent. But I've got a lot of sympathy with that as well, because there are limited opportunities, limited time to respond in hustings, and you've got to use the time wisely to try to get out the messages that you want to deliver. And of course, in the context of a Conservative Party leadership election, the people in the room at those hustings in the parliamentary stages are all pretty experienced politicians themselves. And so you take your chances. If you want to ignore a question and answer something else, it will not go unnoticed.
And how important is it that the 1922 committee remains independent of influence from the party leadership?
I think it's essential because we don't have a separation of powers between the legislature and the executive in our country. There is just always the possibility that the legislators feel that their only sort of route to career progression, their route to perceived success in politics is going to be through the patronage of leaders and prime ministers. And the danger that prime ministers will use that to try to squeeze out any dissent, to try to homogenize a political party and prevent people from trying to push for their strands of opinion within a party, I think is always quite great. So it's really very important to make sure that there is an independent body which can stand up to the leadership and can be a bulwark between the backbenchers and the leadership. Try to make sure that the backbenchers are treated with respect and are given some space to express views that might sometimes be a little bit different, might sometimes not be on message. But in a parliamentary democracy, people are electing representatives who will have a broad spectrum of views, and we need to have a way of accommodating that, whether it's in open discussion within the 1922 committee, whether it's through the chairman and officers of the 22 and the executive meeting with the leader of the party and passing on views and concerns. But I think that independence is absolutely essential. There's virtually nothing else in the institutions of the Conservative Party now which isn't largely controlled by whoever happens to be leader at the time. But the Whip's office isn't independent. Of course, there is a dual loyalty, which is to the success of the party. But most fundamentally, the Whips are there to try to ensure that the government, and in particular the leader, gets their business through in the way that they want to get it through. I often thought that the chairman of the 1922 committee is like the mirror image of a chief whip, in that the chief whip is trying to ensure that backbench colleagues do what the leader wants, and the chairman of the 1922 committee is there to communicate to the leader where colleagues might not be prepared to go along in a certain direction, or whether perhaps there should be a compromise, which helps to keep everybody happy and united.
Did you have a succession plan when you stood down as chair of the 1922 committee?
No, I couldn't really have a succession plan because we were coming up to a general election. The general election, of course, came more rapidly than many of us had expected as well. And so I was going to remain chairman until the end of the parliament. And of course, the consequence of having a general election is you don't know who's going to be there afterwards when the smoke clears. So I was aware of some of the officers of the 1922 committee who were interested in standing to be chairman, assuming they were returned at the general election. And in due course, it proved that the two officers who did come back were Bob Blackman and Sir Geoffrey Clifton Brown, and they were the two candidates to be chairman after the election.
Turning to your career again, what's the most important lesson you've learned from someone else that's helped you?
Important lessons learned. Certainly a long time ago, I had a lot of fun working for a much older chap, Oliver Knox, at the Centre for Policy Studies. He certainly taught me the importance of enjoying your work and perhaps not taking life too seriously always. But the most important lesson, not necessarily taught deliberately or directly, was at the time that I had to make that very difficult decision to resign from the front bench so that I could carry on standing up for grammar schools and selective education. My brother-in-law quoted an American politician who had said, "Doing the right thing never feels wrong." And I think that's something I would certainly pass on to others facing a personal dilemma in politics. Ultimately, you've got to be able to look yourself in the face. You've got to be able to respect yourself and know that there is a purpose in what you're doing. And if you always compromise and always toe the line rather than pushing your own beliefs, then you end up at a point where there really isn't any point in you being there. It could be anybody. It's not always in your interest in the short term, but in the long term, I think it often is.
And can you remember the worst piece of advice you've ever got?
Probably the worst piece of advice would be from a party whip standing by the division lobby telling me to go in a certain direction. There are many occasions when I voted with my party and perhaps with retrospect thought, why on earth did I do that? It was a very bad piece of legislation or bad piece of advice. But again, it comes back to this very difficult tension in our system. There is an expectation that you will mostly go along with your party, and if you instead mostly rebel, mostly vote independently of your party, then you aren't taken seriously. So there is a difficult balance to strike somewhere between that.
Obviously, people go into politics because they actually want to make a difference, just like you did. And part of that is sometimes around working cross-party to get stuff done. So what would you say in your time has been a good example of this happening in practice?
I mean, I suppose partly because I spent so much time as chairman of essentially the Parliamentary Conservative Party, probably didn't spend that much time working cross-party. There are some interesting exceptions. Important roles in representing the interests of parliamentary colleagues. And think of some of the examples where the code of conduct for members of parliament was being revised. And it's quite interesting how often I was able to work together with the chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party, sometimes even representatives from Liberal Democrats or the Scottish Nationalists, because sometimes there are just common themes where you can see that there is a danger that something which is often well intentioned might actually reduce the independence and the freedom of members of parliament to do their job and to stand up for the things they're meant to be standing up for.
You mentioned the election earlier on. Obviously, it was a bit of a bloodbath for the Conservative Party that evening. Can you tell us how you felt, considering you weren't standing, but you knew that many colleagues were about to lose their jobs?
It's a terrible mixture of emotions. For me, I'd made the decision quite a long time before the election that I was going to stand down. I'd been a member of parliament for 27 years by the time of the election, huge privilege representing my hometown for 7 parliaments, and so very aware that that was ending. Certainly, there is a very painful fact about politics, and certainly about British politics, that it is very unsentimental. And when you get those big swings to the Conservatives in 2019, to Labour in 2024, they sweep away very good people who have done a great job in Parliament, who've worked hard for their constituents, who believe things, who've been honourable, along with people who maybe didn't work as hard and weren't as honourable, and maybe have sometimes let the side down by behaving manner that was below what should be expected. It does have very little relationship to the quality of the individual. I do think that's something that people, when they're voting, ought to give a little bit more priority to the quality of the Member of Parliament rather than necessarily their view at that moment of their party. Once I decided not to stand for re-election, I had in mind that I'd once again be able to go and sit at home and watch the election coverage overnight with a glass of whiskey or two. And then I found that I was asked to be part of the panel commentating through the night for GB News. So I wasn't able to sit at home comfortably watching Chris Hobbs coming in, but then I was paid quite well for it.
You still got no peace, and now you're in the Lords, and that's very different again from the Commons. How are you finding it?
I think probably coming to the House of Lords from the House of Commons is more difficult than coming in from outside. It is profoundly different in almost every way. The style of it, the manners of it, the way people talk to each other and deal with each other. There's less apparent fighting going on, more calm in the way they present cases. I think the debates are better. It's usually, if you want to go and sit in the chamber for an hour or so, you usually will hear some interesting speeches. The speeches in the House of Commons can be very formulaic and very party political. So I think there are certainly upsides. On the downside, because of the composition of the House, even when the hereditaries have gone, which will almost certainly happen later this year, it will then be a wholly appointed House. And that leads to an expectation that the House will not be too assertive, that it should always give precedence to the elected House. And in a funny way, I've come to the conclusion that the House of Lords is specially formed in the way that it is, in order that it won't be taken too seriously, that it will always lack the legitimacy that the House of Commons has through election. And so it is hard. There are times when we won quite big majorities to amend things. For instance, we voted to exempt hospices from the government's new employers' national insurance increase in the same way that the government exempted the NHS. And we won big majorities to do that, and it was sent back by the House of Commons, and we won other big majorities, sent it back to the House of Commons, and the government then batted it away yet again. And the convention then is that the House of Lords will give way and allow the elected House its way.
What issues are you tending to concentrate on?
You kindly mentioned my book Kingmaker, and I'm still very busy promoting that. And I've been invited to quite a lot of literary festivals around the country, which my wife and I are enjoying very much, and it's all good fun. But that's taken up quite a lot of time as well. And so in the House of Lords, certainly I made my maiden speech on the Hereditary Peers Bill, and I've spoken again at committee stage on that. My personal view is that we should at some point move to a wholly elected upper house, but obviously that is a contentious view, and there are many different models and approaches that might be taken. Then I've spoken on the tobacco and vaping bill, and will hope to be able to take part in some of the discussions on the children's wellbeing education bill, which does some very unwelcome things, particularly removing freedoms from academy schools and risking setting back some of the great progress that's been made in recent years.
How do you think the government is doing so far?
I think the government's been pretty dreadful, really. There are things like the assault on academy schools, which I think is just really unfortunate. But then if you look at the economic record and the fact that the government claims that the economy is its central mission and getting economic growth moving again, well, they inherited an economy that was growing, not as strongly as we would like, but it was growing. They've pushed it backwards rather than helping it to grow. A lot of their initial measures, both talking the economy down and their first budget, brought in measures that are actually going to impede economic growth. They have the increase in employers' national insurance contributions, which is a tax on jobs, which is reducing the amount of demand in the labour market. We saw some of the tax changes, that of course dreadful things affecting family farms and family businesses, which I think is a really unfortunate thing. So a lot of their early measures now to be followed by the Employment Rights Bill, and this crazy idea of introducing employment rights from day one. Those are likely to hold growth back. And then we've got things which, if they were done right, might have some real merit. Planning reforms and the determination to get more houses being built. But even if they do help to promote growth, it's going to be later rather than sooner, because those things don't happen quickly. So I think they've got themselves in quite a difficult position, and seeing the state of panic on the Labour benches now following the local elections and the big inroads that Reform made at Labour's expense there, I think it's just fascinating watching the remarkable shifts of policy, or at least of rhetoric. Thinking of the Prime Minister's speech on immigration, remarkable to see the flexibility that Keir Starmer was showing on what used to be important matters of principle for him.
Do you think we have lost the two-party system with the rise of Reform now?
I think it's much too soon to say. I think certainly if the current opinion poll figures were to be maintained, then there's a significant possibility you'd have a very, very messy House of Commons after the next election. And that would be difficult for everybody to navigate. One of the things that I suspect is that as Reform goes more and more for vulnerable Labour seats at the next election, I think Reform may well continue to tack to the left on economic policy. For me, I think one of the most important things is that the Conservative Party should be there as the obvious home for voters who want economic sanity and want to see properly managed public finances. Because I'm afraid we will have seen through the years post the COVID response and the massive amounts of money spent on that, the huge amount of borrowing Boris Johnson's government engaged in onwards, we will have seen governments, Conservative and then Labour, spending too much, borrowing too much, taxing too much. And the one thing we can say without any doubt is it doesn't work. So we need a proper Conservative prescription for the economy, and I do think we'll be the only people offering it.
What do you think the world will look like in 5 years' time?
I think it'd be very brave man or woman to predict that. And when I saw that enormous Labour majority coming in on the 4th of July, albeit delivered by a very small percentage of the votes, 34% of the vote, being 170 odd seat majority in the House of Commons, I thought, well, at least there's likely to be a period of stability and certainty, and people will be able to rely on certain expectations. But that hasn't proven to be the case. And I think the world is just now a very volatile, very difficult, very dangerous place to navigate. And obviously the invasion of Ukraine, the conflict in the Middle East, the question of how to deal with the threat from Iran, the recent conflict that was starting to flare up again between India and Pakistan, and the medium to long term issue of a more assertive, wealthier and stronger China. I'm afraid I don't have any great optimism the world will be looking more stable, calmer or safer in 5 years' time.
My final question was going to be, what gives you the most hope for the next generation? And do you feel positive about the future? But you think that there are many times that are unstable ahead of us by the sounds of things.
I think it's unlikely all to resolve itself any time soon, but I am an optimist, and I think what gives me optimism is people, and it's the younger generations who will pick up the baton and take things on. And the thing about politics is you never solve everything. You just do your best for the time that you're there, and sometimes people get it right more often than others. The point is that people have to get on with it, pick up the reins and take the thing forward. And any of us who've been around for a bit longer can help during that process, then I hope we can.
Lord Brady, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today and expanding on some of the interesting times that you've had during your political career. And thank you to the listeners who've hopefully enjoyed the show as much as we've enjoyed making it. If you have any questions regarding the podcast, please feel free to comment. If you think it's worth coming back, please like and subscribe. If you feel that you need something to tide you over to the next podcast, please buy Kingmaker or Party Games, which I wrote on Amazon. And on that note, I'll see you next time. Have a good week, one and all.